So many times I've been asked the question, what 3 conditions would need to be met in order for me to feel comfortable having sex exclusively outdoors? And I always say the same thing. Number 1, decriminalisation. Number 2, good faith. And number 3, viable logistics. Let me take you through it in a little bit more detail. As regards decriminalisation, this must be considered from 2 different perspectives, whether it is public sex on public property or public sex on private property. Having public sex on public property is subject to indecency laws. However, the status of criminality as regards the Sex Act itself is subject to interpretation. This is Criminal Law Amendment Act 1935, Section 18. Every person who shall commit at or near and in sight of any place along which the public habitually passes, as of right or by permission, any act in such a way as to offend modesty or cause scandal or injure the morals of the community shall be guilty of an offence. Now, this is pretty deep stuff. It's not the act itself, but the interpretation that the viewer has on the act, which creates the status of criminality. When the act passes into the eyeball of another person. In this way, the witness's own subjective sense of modesty and morality sets up the parameters for this law and places a clear onus on the person having the sex to create some kind of visual impediment between themselves and the onlooker.
Like a €750,000 semi-detached house.
The clause at or near and in sight of means that this doesn't just apply to public property. This could apply, for example, to your front garden or to a street-facing window. This is tyrannical. I can't live like this. So, I would need either a revoking of the indecency laws or some new legislation put in place which criminalises looking at me when I don't want to be looked at. The only property I privately own is a
2005 3-door Corolla hatchback with a 1.3 litre engine
and a
2.1 litre 2011 313 CDI Luton body Sprinter.
And I'll do you a good price on the Toyota if you can recommend me a reliable and preferably single Mercedes mechanic. Anyway, both of these locations technically constitute indoor sex, so for the purpose of this conversation, it's not relevant. Public sex on private property generally for me will hold implications both for trespassing and indecency laws. Trespassing laws seem complicated enough to invoke when it comes to short-term trespassing, as might be relevant for a sexual encounter. Unless you can keep going until they get an injunction, in which case. However, the time it takes to follow the due process involved in the proper legal route might actually create less favourable conditions for public sex on private property, as increasingly property owners take matters into their own hands. So even if there was a revoking of trespassing laws, there's still the possibility of a face-off with a vigilante farmer possessed by that potent invader terror, and I just don't think I'd be able to keep my head in the game. That kind of adversity doesn't do it for me. Speaking of which, say for example my above mentioned suggestions were unlikely to be carried out. There is also the possibility that the problem of criminalisation could be enveloped into a sexual fetish. For example, if I could develop a very specific sexual taste for the accusing witness, the violent Garda, the vigilante farmer, and of course, the courtroom presiding and deliberating over my sexual morality, then criminalisation wouldn't be a problem. It would be an advantage. A little extra frisson. Now, I would consider myself to be extremely sexually ambitious, but that is categorically beyond me. I can imagine feeling a certain degree of emotional reservations about just how easily I probably would adapt to a life of exclusively outdoor sex. As in, I'd just be getting into the swing of it when suddenly my mind would be flooded with thoughts like, am I really into this? Or is my body just hypermorphing to suit the economic conditions again? I think I would need at least 3 preparatory therapy sessions, which at a reduced rate would come to €150, and then possibly a couple of maintenance follow-on sessions just to check in on how I'm doing over the years. Now, I'm not afraid to let it be known that the undulations of my personal libido do not line up precisely with clement weather conditions. Therefore, having sex outdoors for extended periods of time poses risk of all kinds of exposure illnesses, including trench foot, twisted ankle, or even the common cold. Safer sex practices would have to extend to sourcing a small arsenal of equipment, including tarpaulins, waders, foil blankets, emergency hydration packs, wrist and ankle supports, knee pads, sunscreen, as well as haulage for all of this gear. So that's it, folks. Those are my 3 conditions that would need to be met in order for me to have sex exclusively outdoors. Say, for example, you were to divide all the land on the island of Ireland equally among all the people who live on the island of Ireland. That would amount to about 1 hectare each, or 2.5 acres. This field behind me is about 1/4 of an acre, so the land would be about 10 times the size of that. I'm not saying this is what should be done, I'm just saying this would represent an immediate solution to the question of where am I supposed to have sex. So this proposal about land redistribution sounds kind of far-fetched. They actually did try to do this before. Kind of. Basically, the situation back then was there was a lot of tenants living in unworkably overcrowded situations, while a minority of landlords owned scandalously huge areas of land. Anyway, this overcrowding on small farms was unsustainable, especially for farming tenants along the Atlantic coast, which was marked as a particularly congested district. So the government in Westminster brought in a series of acts through a government body called the Land Commission to encourage the transfer of ownership from landlords to tenants across the 4 provinces. Firstly, this took place through individual brokering of smaller farms, then through the voluntary purchase and resale of large estates, and finally through compulsory purchase by the government of large estates. In this process, millions of acres of land were redistributed. Hundreds and thousands of tenants became the owners of their own land and effectively began repaying a mortgage rather than rent to a landlord. This, to me, is one of the most significant stories around land colonisation in Ireland, and yet it took place before the foundation of the Republic. What did they have to do to... So yeah, the impetus of land redistribution came from the period when the rural Irish had started to make a habit of murdering landlords whenever they were given cheek. But it was also brought about through the cooperation and unity of collective organisation, petitioning to the state body through the legitimate means of public gathering, economic divestment and parliamentary engagement. And also... As matrilineal inheritor of the legacy of agrarian radicalism, I deeply resent the contemporary notion of trickle-down sexual morality from the urban context to that of the rural. Let me give you an example.
Perhaps no murder of any landlord in Ireland was more rapturously celebrated than that of Lord Leitrim in Donegal. This is owing in part to his economic mistreatment of his tenants, but also because of his employment of droit du seigneur. That is, the asserting of one's right over a tenant's bride on her wedding night in advance of the bridegroom. Historians debate the validity of such accounts, but I don't see any point in debating whether this happened in the past when it's clearly still happening in the present.
And to this day, you can still spit on Lord Leitrim's gorgeous coffin in a crypt on Church Street in Dublin. So, what are you going to do with your hectare of land? Oh my god, what?
Wait, okay, hear me out. There's this idea that I think comes from bad British imperialist attitudes, but I think might be kind of true. It was this theory that the rural Irish tenant farmer was enabled, nay, facilitated in his sexual voraciousness by the potato. Feeding a family off potatoes was possible on a smallholding farm, right? So having kids, and therefore sex, at a younger age without having expanded your own property by buying someone else out was totally grand. I don't know if this is actually true, but if it worked for them, it might work for me. It's worth a try.
In the late 1870s, Ireland was reeling from the still living memory of the famine, and in particular the effects of landlordism from that period. Now let's take a moment to learn about two attractive men who were both born in 1846.
Michael Davitt's family was evicted from their house in Strad, County Mayo, when he was 4 years old, which is why he had to move to England, which is why he had to become a child labourer, which is why his arm got amputated after an industrial accident, which is why he got to study instead of work, which is why he learned about Irish history and became a Fenian, which is why he spent his 20s in prison before being released and coming over to Ireland in 1877 with the aid of Charles Stewart Parnell, who was being voted in as president of the Home Rule Confederation because he was getting a reputation for effective obstructionist tactics in Westminster, because he spent a lot of time studying the rules of Parliament, and because he could spend his 20s kind of figuring out what his politics were, because at the age of 12 he inherited a large estate in Avondale and Wicklow. Parnell was a parliamentarian through and through, albeit a disruptive one, whereas Davitt, although he too became an MP, was more radical in his outlook and more grassroots in his methods. Davitt founded the Land League, and Parnell was made its president. With huge support from an agitated rural population, they began their campaign on behalf of Irish tenants, including the 3 Fs: fixity of tenure, fair rent, and freedom of sale.
Sorry, they were campaigning for that in the 1870s. What the fuck went on in the meantime, so? In the first 2 decades of the Irish Republic, the land question was generally divided between 2 different perspectives. The first was the sustaining of large-scale grazier farms, which was said to improve relations with the UK through lucrative beef exports. Ah yeah, no hard feelings, lads. What can I get you? This kind of went awry when Eamon de Valera stopped paying compensation to the UK for the land that they'd lost when they moved out of the southern state. Because Ireland had to pay for Ireland to be allowed to have Ireland back. Or at least 80% of it. Anyhow, they called it quits at 10 million. Absolute bargain. Would buy again. The other conflicting policy was the continued project of redistributing the land into smaller farms for growing crops, which would provide economic self-sufficiency and employment for many rural families. This would require up to 2 million acres of land to be bought up and redistributed to those in need, a policy that Cumann na Gael called the purest of communism. Of course they did. If anything, it was the purest of cronyism.
The Land Commission's purchasing and distribution, while it did improve livelihoods and create upward mobility for huge amounts of people, was meant to prioritise farmers in congested districts, landless labourers, and people whose farms were too small to support their families. However, in practice, the process was subject to local petitioning, neighbours sabotaging each other and accusing each other of scandals to undermine their claims for land. Also, being in need became less important than being a member of whatever political party was in power at the time. This created a new social problem, where once the British government or the local landlord stood between you and the land you hungered for, now it was your own neighbour. The land became marketised, and the larger farmers began to buy out the smaller ones once again. The people who were left behind during British rule were the same people being left behind in the new republic.
Why did I only learn about this history for the first time? Because I had to from our project. Well, for one thing, the entire archive of the Land Commission is completely off limits, in storage somewhere in Portlaoise. But why isn't this discussed in the same terms as, say, like 1916 or the War of Independence? Like, I get that there's a lot of significant parliamentary and military moments, but in terms of the colonisation of Ireland, the land is the land, right?
So for the British government, who thought that the Land Commission might have brought stability to their reign in Ireland, these questions must have been separate. But for a lot of landlords whose occupancy of the land was supported by British rule, the Irish national question and the Irish land question must have had the same answer.
No, fuck off!
For many Fenians, the establishment of independent nationhood was the priority, after which the land question could be answered with greater ease. But for the Land League, the national question and the land question were intertwined, with the land coming first. Of course, many low-income farmers and landless labourers had joined the movement for Home Rule because of immediate concerns about their own living conditions, not because of the location of the ruling parliament. This group in particular really got let down in the Republic, when the land question was swiftly swept aside when the national question was resolved. And when I say resolved, I mean not resolved.
Anyway, look, the way I see it, there's one and only one land question. Where the fuck am I supposed to have sex?
Well, while trespassing and indecency laws remain in place, if I want to have sex without fear of criminalising voyeurs, trigger-happy farmers, and the dreaded trench foot, the answer to that question is going to be mostly indoors.
So what's stopping you from getting in there? I can't go back to my hometown anymore. It's just not responsible. I'm from a small place and I'm, there's plenty of American economists who agree when people like me move into a place, the property prices just, we make the place more attractive, more colourful, even just walking down the road. And it's true. Every time I came home last year, I checked the rental prices and they'd gone up week on week, and that's just from me visiting. And next thing, it'll be big businesses and hotels moving in, student accommodation everywhere in the village, even though there's no university. But when was it ever about the students? And the people in my hometown will start defaulting on their mortgages and going into rent arrears, and they'll have to move away, and it'll be all my fault. Yeah. Did you know that that's not how economics works? Here, let me explain it to you. I just show you this resource?
There's no such thing as cheap Irish houses, and any system put in place to advertise them as such is just going to inflate the prices that they are claiming are cheap. Why are humans the only animals that have to pay just to be someplace?
Oh, they actually aren't. It's much worse than that. When the horses had to stop racing recently, there was immediate economic consequences for the horses themselves. They weren't able to earn money through racing, but they still incurred the same costs for feeding, veterinary, stables. They couldn't be given away or sold at low cost because this would have a deflationary effect on other racehorses. So it was coming to the point where they just were going to have to be shot. When Shergar was kidnapped by whoever done it, the Aga Khan was asked for
£2 million.
for his return. Shergar was worth
£10 million.
but he was owned by a syndicate of 35 people who couldn't agree if the
£2 million.
was worth it. At this stage, Shergar was retired to stud, but if he had gotten injured or sick during his kidnapping, he'd be worthless to them. How can it be that in this field, Shergar is worth £10 million, and yet, in this field, Shergar is not even worth £2 million?
Are you saying that the answer to the national question and the land question is the same?
Departition.
Okay, I'm game, let's go!
Oh, we actually can't do that yet. It's unconstitutional.
I don't know, maybe we have to go at plan B then.
Fuck that. It's bad enough sleeping with your landlord on your wedding night. Never mind for the rest of your life.
I don't want to be trapped in a future where I only have sex with people with more wealth than me. That sounds kind of fucking ridiculous. And I'm really I found somewhere like saving myself out, the problem would still remain. I'd be the one with the power. Maybe I'd be a tyrant. We certainly wouldn't be equal consenting adults. Is this situation even legal? This contravenes my constitutional right to have sex with every other willing person on the island of Ireland. You are having your rights curtailed and through no fault of yours are being rendered unable to have sex with me. This is unacceptable, and what's more, until every person on the island of Ireland has suitable accommodation for their personal needs, be it on the land, lake or lay-by, my personal sexual liberty is in jeopardy. What is the government doing about this?
I mean, they've done loads. Choosing not to build social housing when we had money, selling land zoned for social housing onto private developers, a policy of over-reliance on HAP, paying Gardaí to oversee illegal evictions, and achieving 10,000 people in emergency accommodation. And then, ingeniously, putting it back on me and you. The peddling of this narrative of collective culpability after 2008 was so clever because when you're crippled with guilt and shame, even if those feelings aren't your own, but have just been handed to you to hold for a minute, it makes you pliable and compliant.
I bought so many swords in 2005. I was young, reckless. I didn't know when to stop. And now the country is ruined.
Asher, look at, weren't we all at the same thing? Anyway, it's not just the lack of intervention by the government when it is needed that's the problem. In one sense, a wholesale abandonment of the people would at least offer a degree of freedom. The problem extends to the fact that when people who've been priced out of housing do what they need to do with the things that they have to hand to house themselves, then the government becomes pro-intervention. What this flags for me is that if the way that you move into housing doesn't create wealth for somebody else, be it a landlord, a mortgage broker, or an American lizard, the chances are it's probably illegal. Now let's take a look at a typical mid to late 19th century domestic eviction. Tens of thousands of evictions took place during periods of famine and economic decline, because of tenants being in rent arrears, but also because of landlords not wanting to pay poor law taxes, and especially because of landlords wanting to redesign their estate to include a new pleasure gardens with a state-of-the-art 72-inch telescope like the one the Earl of Ross has. I can't see the stars with all these peasants in the way. Anyway, the agent on behalf of the landlord and the guards on behalf of the would show up to the house with guns, battering rams, and hired local traitor goons to oversee the eviction. They were then instructed to put a hole in the walls or roof of the house so as to make it uninhabitable, because the purpose here wasn't to find a more lucrative tenant, it was to clear the land. The tenants would often act to resist, creating rudimentary barricades and throwing cow shit and boiling water out the windows. In order to weather out the night, the evicted family often gathered together what they could from the rubble to make a small hut from the debris of thatch and stone. The following day, the goons were instructed to return once more and break apart the hut, thus removing the evicted from the land for good. History is so interesting, isn't it? I can't believe what went on. Anyway, as you can see here, we're moving from a question of brute economics into something much more fundamental. This is the obliteration of a person's capacity to simply move parts of the material world around in order to create a protection between their body and the elements.
Now we're going to have a story from the south of the country.
Dear Sister Elizabeth, I'm writing with an unusual offer. I was wondering if you'd like to move from your convent in New Zealand to West Cork, in the south of Ireland, to live alongside me. Well, I haven't much, but there is here the makings of 2 small wooden cabins, one for your sleeping quarters and another for your prayer. I found I can grow plenty here for myself, and with an extra pair of hands, we could grow more than double what I do now, and sell it at the co-op. I think you will feel quite at home in the landscape of your ancestors. In fact, down at the end of the allotment, a velvet blanket of moss makes a shallow bank on the lakeside, and the water just fine for drinking, and the smell of wallflowers, and the finches singing, and the cattle lowing, and the daily prayers, and the bus to town, and the bread baking. It's not a bad life. I do hope you'll consider. Kind regards, Sister Moira.
Okay, well maybe it didn't happen exactly like that.
But 2 nuns did move in together in a remote self-built dwelling compound to live in anarcho-primitivist hermetic silence, and they were brought to court in Skibbereen because their wooden cabins breached section 154 of the Planning and Development Act. Anyway, one of the nuns says to the judge, "I'm sorry, I'm living a very busy life of prayer and I don't have time to be studying county council laws." And then the judge says to her that she has to demolish her house. When the nuns inform him that he's about to now make them effectively homeless, the judge says that in that case, they better start praying for alternative accommodation. And you can see what he's doing there. The whole, we're sick of the church thinking you're above the law. And now I'll show you. He feels confident going on record saying that because he knows there's a general consensus now that we're all psychologically messed up by the church, especially in relation to sexuality. But while the church may have had fire and brimstone living rent-free in our minds, the state has been rigorously regulating access to those intimate domestic spaces that sometimes, on a good day, all going well, are beyond the reaches of church condemnation.
The church's own position on this has varied throughout history. For example, the local landlord in the next town over, when he got shot in the wake of his famine fuckery, the Archbishop John McHale, the Lion of Tuam, didn't defend the killing itself, but was ferociously defensive of the local priest, who didn't defend the killing itself, but did say a couple of bad things about the landlord from the altar, and it did have big Fenian energy. Anyway, it was a whole thing. Things got said. The Pope had to get involved, but long story short, it was clear that Archbishop McHale, the Lion of Tuam, had sentiments that ran against landlordism. He was even in favour of the 3 Fs. However, a few decades later, this same man, the Lion of Tuam, refused to show public support for the Land League, and the clergy in general, even the more revolutionary ones, weren't very supportive of the Land League. And the reason that is because the Land League worked with women. They make a kind of a sly reference to this in a public address from 1882. They wrote that they hoped the women of Ireland will continue to be the glory of their sex and the noble angels of stainless modesty.
In October 1881, the Land League was suppressed following the imprisonment of its leaders. In their place, Fanny and Anna Parnell then formed the Ladies' Land League. Anna, yeah, I think we should take this movement in a different direction, like more hands-on. Oh, like build houses, help prisoners. Yeah, and expand. Teach Irish history to children? Nice.
Right, so say we eliminate the government and capitalism from the picture. Tomorrow at 12 noon, Leinster House, see you there. Even after the elimination of the systems that leave us priced out and regulated out, there still is at least one other barrier. That is the socio-sexual factor, or being fucked out. You've been evicted. The nature of exclusive land ownership means that any person who doesn't own the land that they're presently standing on is navigating a complex formula to balance their personal freedom with their environmental welcome. If you overspend on your freedoms, your welcome might be compromised. However, if you fixate entirely on achieving and maintaining your welcome, your personal freedom is likely to be self-curtailed. In particular, this involves a nuanced reading of the subtle tacit sexual codes of a dwelling house and acting accordingly. Every domain has its own local coding, which can also change, and you must keep up. Sexual freaks who grow up in religious households come to learn this intuitively. However, there are also people who are so marked by their differences of one kind or another that they never experience this feeling of welcome, no matter how much they conform their behaviour. He's fine. I have him. And he's my boyfriend now. Yeah, we're really happy. He's a Pisces like me. He's 42 years old now, which is old for a racehorse, but he's younger, it counts, if you know what I mean. Anyway, every place me and Shergar have tried to rent, there's been some kind of problem, you know? Whether it's judgmental housemates, tyrannical landlords. It's just frustrating because it just contrasts with the story that Ireland tells of itself. Oh, we've come so far, oh, we've turned a corner. I think this is just a story that's used to sell Ireland to multinational corporations that don't pay tax. Baby? If there's no material infrastructure in place in which we can enact these newfound sexual and social freedoms, then those freedoms are purely notional. You've heard a million times, come to Ireland, invest in Ireland, and maybe your boyfriend can be a £10 million racehorse too. But it's not that simple in real life.
So it's built on a Mercedes chassis for a 26-ton trailer. He sleeps in the rear there, I sleep in the front. Right, wait till you see this. The sides pop out, nearly doubling the internal space for when he wants to come and join me in the front. There's 2 ramp access doors, storage there on the side for all our BDSM stuff, so you don't have that nightmare of choosing what you're bringing and what you're leaving behind. Okay, I don't know what's going on with that flag there. Oh, God. The rear compartment fits up to 6 horses, so he's able to bring along all his stud mare girlfriends, who are each and every one welcome and equal members of our family. So yeah, it's perfect. It's perfect for us. It's called the Equa Cruiser. It's around £200,000, and then plus VRT, obviously. Oh no, we don't have a deposit, no. No, we need to move in now.